Great, thank you. So this next question is a little bit of a long one. So, is there a better word that we can use to indicate a connection with and a concern for the environment instead of quote unquote environmentalist to be more inclusive of other non-white cultures like Latinx?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And honestly, it's when we're teaching and we don't know the answer, we're like, hey, what do you think? But sincerely, I do think that this is a question for the students. The reason that I chose to keep the term environmentalism is because it's got cultural cachet and there's a lot of opportunities and money, right? Green jobs involved with being part of the environmental movement. And so my goals in writing the book were basically to help my students see that you are environmentalists, even though you may have not thought of it in that way, and to help my fellow white environmentalists see also that you are environmentalists, even though you've never thought about it that way. And so I would certainly be open to having a new word, but I think there's political power behind having that word, and that was why I kind of wanted to make it a bigger tint.
And you know what it reminds me of? So I'm a longtime environmental sociologist, formerly from Cal Poly Humboldt. Loggers, people who cut down the trees for a living, didn't like to be called environmentalists because it was associated with tree huggers, right? People they were battling against. So, I think it is time for a new word, perhaps. Like, I understand it's the dominant, but I think, definitely we should be drawing from the students and the community to see what are some better words that we could use, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So we can explore that when we get to the Q&A.
Excellent.
Right. So number 3, what is your biggest takeaway from working with a population that you are not naturally a part of?
That's a tough one, and Dr. Steinberg gave me the questions in advance, and I still don't, necessarily have the best answer. But I would just say, I learned a lot through my research in terms of thinking about my environmentalism and what I'm bringing to the table. And I think consumerism is a really big thing that I thought about personally, in the sense of I got some of my mom friends here in the audience, and I think, and Sarah, you're my mom friend too, and my work friend. But anyway, there's certain containers that we put our kids' food in. If you're a tree hugger mom, they're stainless steel. You're a new tree hugger mom, right? Yeah. You got the stainless steel container that's got this nice kind of eco-friendly rubber topping. And anyway, Tupperware was a huge thing that came up in a lot of my research. They were people would say, why would I buy Tupperware when I can just reuse old, takeout containers and old, butter containers and yogurt containers? And it really, that kind of brought home to me how consumerist oriented my own environmentalism is. So in terms of personal changes, I would say that would be a big one. But just also the generosity of everybody that I met and my students taking me to places that I would have never gone on my own. And just kind of recognizing that there's so much there that people in my field don't talk about at all. And I will say, we're going to go for the $10 billion grant to do a new research project here at CSUN. But the stories that I tell about Spanish-speaking Catholics are not specific to Spanish-speaking Catholics only, right? That whenever I share this research, people will be like, my family is Haitian and we do very similar things, or whatever. I think lots of communities have their own stories that need to be told and shared.
Yeah, I think it's a story of immigrant communities and working class communities and what they do, right? Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Great answer. In your opinion, why have the Latinx communities been ignored by the religious studies and environmental disciplines?
Because we have very narrow understandings of what environmentalism is. And it's really funny because in religious studies, we love to critique the category of religion. There's a lot of students in RS classes in the room right now, right? One of the first things what do we really mean by religion, right? Is it just beliefs? No, it's much more than beliefs. It's much more than just texts, right? We spend a lot of time, there's whole journals dedicated to interrogating the category of religion and its history. And yet scholars of religion and environment, scholars of religion and environment have done great things to interrogate the category of religion, because this field, my field of religion and environment, started basically following the world religions paradigm and saying what are the resources Christianity can offer? Let's look at the texts. what are the resources Judaism can offer for protecting the environment? Let's look at the texts. And then, the next generation of scholars pushed back and said, there's much more to lived experience than just, reading texts, right? So religion and environment became much more ethnographically focused. Let's research communities, see what people are doing. And yet, these same scholars who are really good at interrogating the category of religion, it never occurred to them to ask what we mean by environment. And that's a very fraught term, right? With a very, troubling, challenging history that environmentalists are dealing with. And so without interrogating that term in our research, we're basically just looking for how different communities act like a white environmentalist. So I think that's the reason, yeah.
Great answer.
Thanks.
What are some examples of cultural sustainability that are present in the Latinx groups that you interviewed and learned about? Now, you spoke about a few of them. Is there anything you want to expand on with that? I mean, did anything kind of surprise you?
I think since I touched on kind of some concrete examples, I won't add to that, but I will say this is from outside my research, but it was a very interesting life moment that related. So I run in the mornings, and I'm going through my neighborhood. I'm doing all these interviews, and I heard the thing about the fruit trees, and there is one house in my neighborhood that I go by. Lots and lots of fruit trees. They've got corn stalks growing sometimes. And I was kind of thinking I wonder who lives here. And then, at some point I could see they had a truck with a big decal on the back that said Guanajuato, right? Okay, so there they are. All right, now, one morning I'm out running and we're in a drought. And there's water streaming down the street. Somebody's, I don't know, their sprinkler's broken, what's the deal? But how there's a river of water just racing down the street. And I'm running along thinking somebody should do something about this, right? This is terrible. We've got a drought going on, and people are just, streaming water down the street. I get to the house with all the fruit trees, and the man is in the street. And it's 6 a.m. He's in the street with a bucket, collecting that water and watering his plants. So I don't know, that's just kind of an illustration of, I'm supposed to be the environmentalist, and I'm sitting there this is terrible. Somebody should do something, right? And he's out there with a bucket doing something.
No, I love that story. That shows your own cultural humility. Cultural humility to recognize, hey, I was mistaken, right? He's totally using it. Yeah. So that's great. Way to go. That's why I like you.
I like you too.
So, all right. What will readers gain by reading your book?
I think kind of what I had mentioned before, for my students, and I honestly, I hope that this book is taught maybe at a lot of Cal States, because I want you all to kind of rethink your own inheritances and see your own traditions in a new light and kind of recognize the power and the agency in it, and that, you are an environmental leader already. And for scholars of religion and environment, it's kind of we need to wake up and stop looking at our own noses, I would say. I think that's the main thing for scholars of religion and environment, to recognize how very, very narrow our inherited notions are. And then I wrote this, I hope, in an accessible way as a crossover kind of book. So I hope that environmental organizers will also be interested in reading it. And I have a chapter on there's an organization within the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. This actually doesn't exist anymore, but they were the Catholics that were trying to bring about Laudato Si in the community and do environmental stuff. And it was really, really hard to write that chapter because the people they're good people trying to do good work, right? And so, it's the predominantly white environmental organization, right, that's trying to engage all Catholics across LA. And it's not their fault that they don't know how, but I think it's a limit of our shared environmental imagination about what environmentalism is. And so their understanding of how to reach out to Spanish-speaking Catholic communities is to translate their materials in Spanish. But my point is that we need different stories for different communities. So I'm hopeful that for that type of community of environmentalists that they can read the book and kind of develop a little humility and, understanding that they need to be listeners in addition to leaders.
I like that. So in effect, the secret goal of your book is to tell them what's what, right? You're telling them what's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's good. What is the biggest lesson that you learned while writing this book?
Do more research with your students, maybe? I mean, sincerely, like, I feel very, like, when you apply for a new job out of grad school, you just, like, go wherever the heck they'll take you, right? And I just feel extraordinarily fortunate to have landed here. And, I mean, that is, like, what I get to talk to the religion and ecology folks at the big AAR meeting, and I think what I will tell them is, you know, to do better research, to learn from your students and let them take you out and show you their worlds, I think.
And that's a great note. That's a great note to end on for our choreographed question and answer. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lemus.
All right, I'll take it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so questions, answers, terms, new terms. My mom used to pack my lunch in sour cream, reused sour cream tubs. I wish she had told me it was environmental stewardship, because maybe I would have groaned. But, you know, she didn't know. Was there a hand up?
Oh, not a threat.
Okay.
This is for my own selfish purposes, but I'm more interested in finding out how you would, in the classroom, make those connections with your students, because I have focused on sustainability in my past classes, and going in, some of the students were not that engaged with the topic. So my idea was to draw them in through food and family practices. Do you have any other ideas of getting them interested immediately in discussing sustainability or environmentalism?
So, I mean, the way I do it is to share the stories from my research, because a lot of stories people connect with, you know, something very, very similar, or maybe they're like, oh, well, you know, the story's not the exact same, but it's, you know, we have something similar in my family. So for me, it's the storytelling and, you know, learning from the students, right? Kind of what are your experiences? You know, you might think about relationships with the land instead of environmentalism. And I think that goes back to Dr. Steinberg's question about another word instead of environmentalism, just kind of asking your students, you know, about these relationships and how they live with the earth and the people around them and the things around them, and see how they describe it and kind of building on there. So, I mean, it took me years and years of conversations with my students to kind of understand what these stories are. And then now it's kind of like, you know, my students told me the stories, and now that I can tell them back to my students, and that resonates because it's, you know, it's similar to their own experiences. So I would say kind of asking questions and listening and learning how they're relating to it, and then you can build on those, you know, to have the conversations. Yeah.
Making you run.
Okay, hopefully it doesn't make noise. I have a super specific question. This is really cool research. I did something kind of similar. I think you can hear me. For my master's project, but how did you talk about nature? Like how did they relate to nature? And I love that you talk about how the word nature, what we think of nature, is also colonialized and, you know, whited, whatever you call it, because of, you know, we think of nature as a national park away from here. So can you talk about what, you know, any stories related to how they relate to what nature actually is?
Yeah. So I honestly just, in my focus group and interview question, I would just say, I don't remember the exact question, but I would say nature, the environment, or creation, however you want to talk about it. And then sometimes I did say, like, is there a better word that I could use? And nothing really, you know, in Spanish, el medio ambiente is the environment, and people were comfortable with that. Or naturaleza, you know, people like the word nature. There's a lot of, I was in a reading group about a year ago on theories of the land. There's a lot of literature on the land and relationships with the land that I think resonated. But honestly, like the La Tierra part, like nobody was talking to me about La Tierra through my focus groups and interviews. So it was really nature, the environment. Creation, somebody did tell me, somebody who's very, he's kind of a leader, he's a lay leader in the church. he made a very big point that for him, he sees creation, and he's speaking to me. He said, when you, like, you be me, I'll be him. When you think about nature, it's just like atoms and, it's scientific or whatever. When I see nature, I see God. And so for him, that's the difference between creation and nature. But he's really the only one that really cared about like getting into the nitty gritty of the terminology. Everybody else is like nature, trees, birds, whatever, and it's kind of like, we already know what we're talking about here. I will say, I told you that, I did the research with the English-speaking and the Spanish-speaking Catholics, and initially I wanted the book to be comparative, but it's really hard to do ethnography in a comparative way because you can't be like, here's a random group of people and let's compare it to this random group of people, right? So it's not, anyway, but in 2020, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops did this big celebration to mark the 5-year anniversary of Laudato Si', and it was during COVID, so they did these online roundtable conversations with U.S. bishops, and they did one in English and one in Spanish. And that was my amazing comparative moment because they asked basically the same questions. It's all U.S. bishops, but some of them happen to speak Spanish. And it was amazing because the conversations were very, very different based on the exact same questions. And the English-speaking conversation was about the environment, climate change, suffering, crisis. I did it like a word count analysis. It was like, seriously, like crisis, alarm, it was all about these big, huge problems with the environment. In the Spanish language conversation, it was totally La Tierra environmentalism. They were talking about connections to the homeland and to agriculture, relationships with trees, all of that. Without me giving the terminology, like they didn't really, environment, nature, trees, whatever, but kind of understandings of what the concepts are definitely varied based on language. Yeah. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Hi. From what you learned in your studies, what advice or tips would you give to students who want to make a difference in environmentalism and climate sustainability but don't know how?
Oh, I think they should go first complete the survey here, and then go hang out with the Institute for Sustainability, which is where it's happening, right? And I will say, like, seriously, we have tons of classes at CSUN now. There's a sustainability minor. I happen to be director of the MA program in sustainability, so there's lots of classes and ways to be involved. But I would direct you to the Institute, who has lots of projects going on. Sarah's here. She spent years doing the sustainability plan for CSUN. They have, how many projects do you have? 400 and something. So there's lots of ways in campus, and then I think as a campus community, we're tapped into more community members to get you connected. So I would say go for it. Here's a community member now.
I have a question going back to terminology. Did you feel that there was any negative feeling when you use environmentalism? Because I know when people say, oh, you're a tree hugger, right away they go to the extreme and say, oh, they're hippies, or, they just...
Yeah.
So did you feel that using the word environmentalism, because when she was saying maybe we should use another term, I just can't find another term. I agree with you that right now it feels like it covers so much, and also politically, and it helps promote environmentalism. But I don't know if you found any negative feelings towards it.
In my research, I really didn't. I was thinking back. So for my first book, I did research in Chicago, and I did a lot of research with African Americans on the south side of Chicago, and there was a lot of distancing from the word environmentalism there, and it wasn't negative, but it was more, like movie stars are environmentalists. Like, I'm not doing enough. Like, the little things I'm doing aren't enough to be an environmentalist. But I didn't get that in this research at all. So I didn't disclose until the very end that I was interested in environment. So I wasn't really using that term. I think the way I pivoted to have them start talking about nature of the environment is I said, lately issues about the environment and climate change have been in the news. And I said immigration. I said climate change, immigration, and the environment have been in the news. What, if anything, does your faith have to say about that? And then the conversation would go through there, and I would do the follow-up questions. But I mean, particularly, so a lot of the people I spoke with are second generation young adults, and environmentalism was a great word. Like they were totally on board with it. They didn't have the negative associations. The one more thing I will say though is, so there was also a group called Fe Ecología, Faith and Ecology, through the Archdiocese. So it was part of the Spanish language young adult ministry. They were trying to be environmentalists, and their models were white people. And they thought they have so much to learn, and they need to teach their elders. So the people that were trying to be environmentalists thought that they were not very good environmentalists, versus the young adults, when you talk to them about Laudato Si, like, oh yeah, we've been doing this all along. My mom taught me that. So that's what I found. I didn't get the like negative tree hugger associations like at all. And in fact, tree hugger did come up at some point in one of the focus groups, and it wasn't necessarily a negative thing.
Yeah, because I feel like, it's part of the traditions.
Yeah.
But once you put a label to it,
Yeah.
people kind of like want to separate themselves from
Yeah.
that label.
Yeah.
They feel like they don't do enough to be
Right.
a tree hugger.
Right.
And I feel it because even in my family or
Yeah.
whatever, I go maybe to another extreme
Yeah.
where I feel like I want to do more,
Yeah.
and I feel like I've already been labeled as.
Yeah. That's interesting, because it's the people who weren't trying to be environmentalists that had all the stories of the environmental things that they were doing. And then there was one guy from Fe Ecología, he said, that whenever he showed up at a party, his family would be like, oh, the environmentalist is here, pull out the recycling bags. So yeah, I can see what you're saying. I don't have an answer, but let's work on it. I'd like to know, you'll find out the answer and you'll let me know.
So, first of all, the one thing I noticed is how much you helped me even recognize things that I do that I hadn't even thought about, and it's like things you just grow up with, right? And it made me think, like, then I thought, you make the example of the stainless steel, environmentalist, food storage containers or, lunch containers, and yeah, that, I just carry the things from my house, right? Whatever fits. So then I thought, there's so many different practices, right, that are in place, in Latinx Catholic communities that would be easy, right, to kind of teach and pass on. But at the same time, the way that you're describing it, you're really talking about a whole formation. Right, like it's in the home, right? It's in the culture. It's a language, right? Like, the plants as your kids or nature as your brother. So, do they translate? Right? Is there things to learn from Latinx Catholics? Do they translate to like environmentalist movements when so much of it is really born of relationality and formation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say the thing I could speak to that I have thought about related to that is that in terms of engaging communities, and so, I said at the beginning, you can't just show up at a church in LA and say like, I'm going to talk to the white Catholics now, right? Like, so even the English-speaking groups that I was with had, a diversity of participants in them, and there were Latinos in those groups, but they were third generation and beyond, and they said stuff pretty similar to all the other white Catholics, right? They did not express La Tierra environmental values, but what I think the kind of prescriptive thing coming from this book is, like, when the U.S. bishops talk about this stuff, they know all of this stuff is happening, right? They know the La Tierra environmental stories, and yet all of their materials start in English and are translated to Spanish, and no wonder they're not morally relevant, right? And so I think what I would recommend is, having Spanish speakers write the materials in Spanish, and it's going to be a different framework, and basically telling those stories in a way that are going to resonate with the communities that they're trying to work with, and not trying to have everybody be a white environmentalist. So kind of like, we should have different stories to engage different communities, and there's no reason to make those third generation Latino communities think that they need to be, like John Muir, but instead, telling, and I will say, my dad came to one of these Zoom talks about this stuff, and he told me, he was like, Amanda, this stuff is in our family too. your grandfather only owned one swimming suit for his entire life. All right, but that's just not a story that we tell, right? And so I think I would, my advice would be to encourage these stories to be told, because the third generation Latinos have these stories too, but maybe they're not talking about them. So maybe, finding out what the stories are and talking with their families can kind of, I don't know, that's my attempt at an answer of your excellent question. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hello. Yeah, just based on my personal observations and experiences, I've noticed that it becomes harder each generation for immigrant families to pass on values, for lack of a better term, they get watered down. Is this something you dealt with during your research, differences between age groups and whatnot, between how strong their values become?
And when I gathered all this, these stories and this data, and I didn't really know how to organize the book, and it took a while to figure out it was definitely based on generation. So first generation had a lot more stories about meeting God in nature and the stuff about the relational things and the porous boundary. That was much more prevalent in first generation than second generation. And then for this research, basically, I specifically focused on Spanish-speaking Catholics, so it was first and second generation, because the second generation bilingual young adults still worship in Spanish, of the people that I met, right? Versus third generation, they're probably worshiping in English. So I didn't really do a lot of the research with that third generation and beyond, except for the ones that happened to be in the English language focus groups where their responses were pretty similar to the other English speakers in the group. Yes, and I think what my, again, prescriptive element would be to say that let's share those stories that are in the first and second generation and let them proliferate among later generations and talk about it in culturally relevant ways instead of taking the dominant forms, let's focus on national parks and endangered planet Earth that's burning, but to share the other kinds of stories too. Does that help? Okay, thanks. Good question.
That's your next book.
Hi. It's not anyway. I was just curious on what kind of lens did you view your research on, going into it, and what things that you didn't expect to get out of it. Did you?
Yeah, I thought about, that's a good question, thank you. The part, I considered putting this in my talk and then I kind of deleted it, so thanks for bringing this up, but I do write about this in the conclusion of my book, which is that I wanted to hide at first how surprised I was to find the values in that first focus group, because in my field, religion and ecology, like I said, there's tons of books saying oh, this is why Catholics will care about the environment, this is why Jews will care about the environment, right? And I went into those early focus groups thinking, it's more than environmental racism and suffering. I thought they were going to have environmental values, but when I got there, and those statements that I shared from the moment we believe in God, we love of all God's creation and nature, I just wasn't expecting working class immigrant communities in Los Angeles to talk about loving nature so much. I'm ashamed of that, right? It just didn't occur to me that would be possible. And then I write about how, that's not a possibility considered in both the scholarly and the environmental spaces that I'd been in. And so yeah, I'd say that's the biggest, I should have known, but I didn't. Yeah. Good question. Oh.
I teach organizational communication, and sometimes I teach systems there. Last semester I thought, let's follow the t-shirt. How many systems does it take to get through so that a t-shirt can get to your hands? And as we were talking about it here, I'm theoretical, and they're like, wait, what? All of that gas, all of the water, all of the electricity, all of the people power that goes into one t-shirt. So they're now becoming environmentalists, right?
That's awesome. Yes.
Hi, so Amanda, I'm asking this question, Dr. Baugh, I'm asking this question as a fellow researcher. Given your study of this particular community, what are some other communities that you would be interested in investigating as well with a similar thing, but maybe not tied so much to Catholicism, but something else?
Yeah. So I have one friend in here, actually no, two friends in here who already participated in interviews for me, so thank you for a project that I'm thinking about, which is urban workers and the workers that maintain our urban landscapes. I thought could be a really good community because exactly this research is specifically among church-going Catholics, so I don't know to what extent it holds true for people who are more kind of cultural Catholics and don't really go to church, or even people who aren't Catholic. But anyway, so in my field of religious studies, there's really interesting conversations going on religion and work and how people carry their religion to them at work. There's also stories about, we got RS304 here that studies religion and gender. There's stories about gender and masculinity. So one kind of project that I started trying to do, but it's kind of not going strongly at this point, is to talk to urban workers, gardeners, landscapers, about kind of their relationships to the land and the extent to which they're carrying their faith with them or not through those. So that I think that could be an interesting way of finding, so I'm not specifically looking at a particular religious group, but just kind of the ways that religion might play a role. So that's my next seed, but I'm also looking forward to that big grant that I'm going to try to get with you so we can hear lots of stories.
We have about a few more minutes, maybe one or two more questions.
Let me get you.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. Love it so far. Wonderful, amazing. Basically, a personal curiosity of mine when it comes to the intersection of religion and sort of eco-criticism, environmentalism, and all that good stuff, is you mentioned, you were speaking about the word stewardship earlier. And so I wanted to revisit that very quickly and sort of pick your brain to elaborate on it a little further, because you are also mentioning really interesting stories about how people are articulating their sort of different definitions for words like nature, and sort of this idea of in nature we need God, but this plant is like my brother, and there's just, and also the idea of stewardship sort of understands nature traditionally as something that we as human beings are supposed to take care of. And I was just wondering, in terms of how those words were sort of intersecting while you were talking to these various individuals within these focus groups, like, did you find an interesting pattern, or did you observe like sort of interesting patterns in terms of like people's understanding of where they position themselves in that hierarchy relationship with divinity or nature? As how does it? I guess I'm just curious, like, how do people process this idea of taking care of something that also takes care of them, that is also divine, but they're also in charge of it?
Yeah. That's a good question, and I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but I guess what I would say is that I really had kind of two different types of responses about, that's a theological anthropology you're talking about here, the relationship between humans and the world around us and God. And like the standard church line, again, is the stewardship, which is, humans are above nature, that, Western Enlightenment worldview. And I did hear that. Like there, if you've been to Sunday school and you've learned about why it's important to care for creation, you probably learned because of stewardship. God gave us this gift. Have you ever learned about stewardship? Yeah. See, God gave us a gift. We need to take care of it. And that is more of the official kind of Catholic line. But it was really fascinating when they would say about loving, we have to take care of nature because of the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. That's not what they learned in Sunday school. That's kind of what they came up with on their own, which is interesting. So I don't know, I think that might be all I have, but we could talk some more. Yeah. Good question.
Thank you.
I think there's one more.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. I'm just wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about next steps that you're thinking about. And as you were talking, I was wondering specifically if you saw like something specific about LA identity within Latinx populations, or how that might be kind of growing out of like a LA Latinx identity.
Yeah. I don't think this is a specifically LA story, even though the research was here, because the Bishops Roundtable was, people from all over, and they said stuff similar. And there's also some literature by literary theorists, in fact, and some historian. The things that I found aren't specific to LA. Certainly the political context here versus, I'm from Texas, so I thought about maybe I could get paid trips to visit, my family and do research there. I think the political context could be an interesting thing to compare, but I don't think that's exactly where I want to go at this time. But yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming.
When you do check in, if you don't mind, there's a QR code in the back. If you can please scan and check in so we have attendance. Thank you.